Right. So thank you so much for joining me today in our 8th webinar of the year, and we're going to be talking about feedback. And like I said, I really enjoy our discussions, and so please feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to ask a few questions, and so this is really a moment and a place to learn from each other and to share ideas. I will talk a little bit about some books that I've been reading and things that I think can contribute to our role as assessors and as teachers as well, because feedback, I think, plays into not only our assessment practices, but also into our teaching practices, right? So I do welcome your comments and suggestions and questions throughout the webinar. Okay? So let me go ahead and get my share my screen.
Oh, Daddy, can you be quiet?
All right, so the title of today's webinar is Maximizing the Effect of Feedback in Language Assessment, and pretty much how to give better feedback to our students, right? Today's sponsor is Mark Algren. He is a trustee at the ELTSociety, also commissioner for CEA, and he was the president of TESOL from 2009 to 2010. So thank you so much. We have an individual sponsor this time. So thank you, Mark, for sponsoring today's webinar. All right. So I wanted to start this webinar, especially because our webinars are about increasing our assessment literacy, with this quote by Mortler in 2004, right? Assessing student performance is one of the most critical aspects of the job of a classroom teacher, but many teachers do not feel adequately prepared to assess their students' performance. So this plays into the assessment literacy levels of teachers, right? But going off of this excerpt, I would like to ask and make you think, you don't have to share right now, but how prepared do you feel not only to assess your students' performance, but also to provide feedback on their performance? Because learning how to provide good feedback is also part of being an assessment literate educator, right? It is part of knowing what to do to give the most effective feedback so that you will improve learning and will also bring beneficial washback to your classroom in terms of your teaching and your instruction, right? So giving feedback is not something that we just know how to do automatically just because we are good teachers, right? It's also a skill to be learned. It is also something that we have to do research, we have to learn, we have to focus on to be able to give adequate and effective feedback to our students, right? So not only do we need to learn how to assess them, but we also need to learn how to interpret what we are assessing and also to communicate that to the students, which is feedback, right? We're communicating the results of our assessment to them. So I think assessment literacy plays an important, a very crucial role also in feedback giving. Okay? So I have a few comics here, PhD comics, because I am about to be done with my PhD. A professor, right? So the graduate student goes to, I don't know if you're familiar with the PhD comics, but it's just always a graduate student and a professor, right, talking. And so the student goes to the professor and says, the professor says, your work output leaves a lot to be desired. In what way specifically? It's hard to say, really. Generally, I would give it like a sad face. And then your feedback is an emoticon or an emoji, right? These days, nobody I think even says that word anymore, right? So this is definitely not good feedback, right? To just, it's a smiley face, a sad face, actually. It's definitely not good feedback. So we'll be talking today about how to give good, effective, adequate feedback to our students so they don't leave the room not knowing what to do, right? When people are learning and trying to learn new skills, right? They must get some information that tells them whether or not they're doing the right thing, right? So this is our feedback. We have to tell our students they're learning the language, right? Or they're learning how to write an essay. They're learning how to write a research paper. We need to tell them, be specific, whether they're doing the right thing or not, and where they can improve, right? So, and this applies to every single learning environment, including the classroom, right? So that is why it is very important to provide students with meaningful feedback, right, to enhance their learning and achievement. But we all know from being in the perspective of the teacher and also being students ourselves that not all feedback is equally effective, right? And it can even be counterproductive, especially if it's presented in a solely negative or corrective way. So the way that we provide feedback can hinder learning, but it can enhance learning. So we have to strive to be better feedback givers, I would say, right? And I think also as students, as teachers, and in our professional careers too, we receive feedback on a day-to-day basis, right? And how effective is that feedback to actually improve yourself, right? Let it like be it at work or whatever you're doing at work, be it in the classroom as the teacher or being a student, and when you're trying to learn a language, right? So think to yourselves, what has worked for you in terms of feedback that you have received in all of these spheres, right? As a student, as a teacher, and in the workplace. And let's try to transform that into the classroom as well. Oh, Eddie, go ahead.
Tani, I was just wondering about, when you're talking about feedback, are we talking about particular skills here or just feedback in general?
We are going to be talking about particular skills, but for now, just in general.
Thank you.
Yeah, all right. So what do you think about this one? Do you recognize, have you ever been on the receiving end of this kind of feedback as well, right? And let's look at the timeline here, right? 1 week before the deadline, 3 days before the deadline, the day before, and then 30 seconds, it needs work, right? This is not effective either. All right, so as instructors, we have the distinct responsibility to nurture a student's learning and to provide feedback in such a manner that the student does not leave the classroom feeling defeated and also feeling that they don't know what to do, right? What am I going to do with this feedback? Do I need to act on it? Do I not need to act on it? Can I just move on, right? Because I feel like a lot of the times, and I don't know if this is your experience, sometimes students will go, they take a test, they do an assessment, and they say, and then when it comes to the second assessment, you say, oh, it will include material that you've learned on the first time around. They're like, oh, but we already did a test on this. Do I need to be tested on this again? I'm like, yes, it's language, it's a process, right? And so I think the same thing with feedback. You cannot just like receive the feedback and completely ignore it. It's like, use this for your future work as well, right? Feed forward, not only feedback, but also feed forward. So let's take a moment here and talk a little bit about how you provide feedback to your students. How prepared do you feel to provide feedback to your students? So I'm going to stop sharing a second here so we can talk a little bit about this. So how prepared do you feel and how effective do you think your feedback is when you're giving feedback to your students? If you want to share your experience a little bit. And Eddie or Elena, is that?
Yeah, sorry. I think that my feedback is useful and correct when the students can improve this very part of the piece or work, if they can correct their mistakes. If they avoid the same mistakes next time, I think the feedback was okay.
And do you have any particular techniques that you always apply when you're giving feedback to try to give the most effective feedback possible?
When I checked their works, for example, and I see that some mistakes are regular, some of the students make these same mistakes, I loudly say it in the class that the mistakes are these, and this. And if a student has some specific mistakes, I talk only to this very person, to this student, and show him his mistakes.
So targeted feedback,
and
pretty
then
much.
Targeted, and then I explain them if he or she doesn't know what to do, how to improve how to
Mhm.
correct mistake. I told him that you
Mhm.
must read, you must do, you must then to correct, to improve.
Uh-huh.
If you want, I say, if you want to improve, you must do these things. If you
Uh-huh.
don't, let's leave the same.
Uh-huh. And so very effective, right? Target it and then tell them what to do going forward,
Mhm.
right? Thank you. Letty? You have raised your hand?
Yes, I think my technique is to ask the student to reflect whether it's a development mistake they need on feedback or really completely lack of understanding. Because sometimes I assume that they have not gotten the point and they say to me, no, I already understand that. This is the part that I don't get. And so I feel like my feedback needs to really address the point. They need more help. And so I always say, this is a development or this is a complete misunderstanding. And once I stop to really listen to what they believe it is, I'm able to provide better feedback for them.
Definitely. And I think what you're trying to get at too is like the origin of the mistake, right? So that you can target the feedback to where the mistake came from.
Right.
And be more effective. Excellent. Jorge, thank you. Jorge, you raised your hand. Are you there? Is it just me not being able to hear him? No?
we can't hear him either.
Yeah.
Tani, if I can jump in, one of the problems, of course, with feedback is that it can take up lots of time, especially with the student numbers. But one of the things I find effective is that just a rubric that I use, for example, for written assignments. And if I have a good rubric in place and the rubric is detailed and the rubric becomes a teaching tool. And I always tell my students, before you write anything, make sure that you're reading the rubric. But then when I'm giving feedback to students, especially when the grades are a bit lower, maybe I can just directly reference the feedback and directly reference the rubric. And I can say, for example, a student gets a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10, and I can just say, refer to the second and third points on the rubric or something like that. So I find that the rubric helps me focus my feedback, and I think I spend less time also by using that rubric a lot.
Definitely. A well-crafted rubric is a gift, I think. It's a gift for us as teachers and for the students, right? It makes it easier, much faster to give feedback. Once I learned that as well, like, oh, you can just circle and point, but then if the rubric is written at a level that the student can understand, the rubric should not be only for ourselves, right? It should be written for the students to be able to improve on their own work and to achieve excellence by looking at, okay, this is what an A work looks like. So definitely, Eddie, I agree 100% with how rubrics are beneficial in so many ways, right?
We can encourage students to, I just get them to do a self-assessment, assess it yourself before you send it to me, and just, have the rubric next to it, and that's what I'm doing. So that helps minimize some of the feedback.
Definitely. And the feedback time that we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Jorge, I think now we will be able to hear you because you unmuted yourself. Or maybe not. Written, and then Maya said here in the chat, written feedback plays a decisive role in the learning process, definitely. And we're going to talk a little bit about different modes of feedback, and then you can tell me, you can share what do you think has been most effective. Oral feedback, written feedback, both, depending on the situation. So we'll be talking about that. Jorge, I don't think we can hear you. Maybe you can type in the chat and I'll address as we go forward. So let me go back here. So a couple of different things that I often go back and reflect on my own practices, right? So the first one is, what does your feedback look like? What kind of modes are you using? Are you only giving feedback orally? Are you only giving written feedback? Are you given more evaluative feedback? Are you given more descriptive feedback, right? What does it look like? Is it too long? Is it a lot? I think it's just my personality. Like I want to tell the students, well, I try not to do that anymore, but in the past, I wanted to tell the students everything that they did well and everything that they did wrong. And it's overwhelming, not only for me in terms of time that it takes to do that, and also overwhelming for the students themselves. So what does your feedback look like, and how it can be improved, right? How often do you choose to provide feedback? Do you provide feedback on every single assignment? Do you provide feedback on things that are not even graded as well? So how often do you do that? How much time do you spend providing feedback? And does that need to be revised as well, right? This is something that we're gonna, Eddie already started getting to that point, and we'll talk a little bit more. Because it also plays into how timely your feedback is. Does it take you forever to give feedback on like essays, for example, right? So how timely it is. And it also depends on the number of students that you have. Has technology helped you? So with this transition of like moving to online teaching because of the pandemic, there was no more written feedback, right? So I could no longer use my different colored pens and highlighters and things that I used to use when given feedback on paper to the students, right? So has technology in a way helped you give feedback, or has it like made it worse and more time consuming, right? And how do your students react to your feedback? So let's take a moment here, about 5 minutes, to talk about these questions, and not any in particular, and you can just comment on the one that you think that it's most interesting, or you have something to share. I'm particularly interested in finding out about technology. Has it helped you or not? And how your students react to your feedback. Do they ignore your feedback? Do they like your feedback? Do they smile when they get your feedback? Do they cringe when they get your feedback? So let's share for a moment here how you feel about any of these questions here. Elena, did you raise your hand?
For the students, I think that my students react positively because they want to achieve better results. They are high grade students, and I always play on their psychological interests. And I say, if you want to improve your knowledge, if you want to get better marks, better results, you would do this, this, and this. And if you don't, stay like this. As for technology, I think it hasn't helped. As for me, it hasn't helped me. Then how often? When they write essays, firstly, when I meet the class, I correct the mistakes and put marks in the margins. Then secondly, I only put the marks in the margins without correcting mistakes in order them themselves find their mistakes. And I ask them, you have 5 or 4 or 10, how many mistakes, correct them and tell me why you made these mistakes. I ask them to correct themselves. And if they can find their mistakes, it's okay. Why to put them bad marks? Maybe it was a spelling mistake. It's nonsense. And as for the essays, I always put them 2 marks, one for the content and one for the grammar. Well, if we say about speaking, I always like to arrange them in the debate or discussion. And I take the sheet of paper, make table, put their names here, and when they talk, when they speak, I put their make mistakes here in my paper. Don't interrupt in their speech. And after they finished, I show each of them show his mistakes or her mistakes and ask them whether they understand or not.
And so actually I have a question related to what you said about for the process of feedback giving, right? And I think it has to do, I want to go back to what Jorge said here too. But do you differentiate, and I'm asking in general here to everybody, not only Yelena, do you differentiate the type of feedback that you give depending on the proficiency level of your class?
Right. I differentiate. If they of the high level proficiency, I think that the content is more important. And their mistakes, if I show them their mistakes individually, they won't use them. They won't make them in the future. And when it was long ago when I taught to small children. So I work only with grown up with.
And I think so. I do think that the kind of feedback that you give must be differentiated, right? Because how much they understand of your feedback, right? And if they don't understand it, they're not going to be able to act on it, right? So it has to be differentiated in terms of like level of proficiency of the class. And then what Jorge is talking about here, depending upon the skill that you're giving, you differentiate the kind of feedback that you're giving as well, right? So he's saying that sometimes he takes notes and then give a general feedback based on the mistakes, right? Never interrupt my students to correct them. He mentioned he likes them to correct themselves because sometimes they recognize they made a mistake. And I think it has to do what you were saying here, Elena, as well, right?
And sometimes before giving, if we have some written task in the class, I leave sometimes. I leave some time and ask them to make peer correction, peer review of the work. And I ask them to write who corrected, who checked, and then they give their works to me. And I say, they are of the, I say that high level of proficiency. I say, if you, a teacher, doesn't correct the mistake, so you make this mistake as well.
Interesting.
If he or she doesn't see the mistake, that is his mistake as well. And I put marks in this case for the author, for the writer, for the author of the work, and for his teacher. No, I mean teacher, that is his peer student. That I think that I motivate them.
To be able to find the mistakes.
To be able to find the mistakes, to feel a little bit.
To pay attention, right?
To pay attention to the mistake. While they are looking for somebody's mistake, they are more attentive.
It's much easier, I think, to find a mistake when somebody else has worked in our own work in general, right? I think that I definitely agree. So let's keep going here. Thank you so much. All right. So when we talk about feedback, right, I think we're mostly thinking, and we relate it immediately to formative assessment, right? Because formative assessment is assessment that is specifically intended to provide feedback on performance to improve and accelerate learning, right? I don't give feedback to my students on their final exam, for example, because most of the time I don't even see them right after the final exam or after a final project, right? So it is during the session that I focus on my feedback, and it's mostly on formative assessment that they get like stronger or more detailed feedback from me as well, right? Research has shown, right, that formative assessment is effective in virtually all educational settings, and just simply giving grades and marks, they do not deliver as much formative effectiveness as tailored comments, right? And in some situations, they can be counterproductive. And this, the research was mentioning, especially with lower level students, right? If they just get a bad grade, that's not really formative or effective, right? So tailored comments, personalized comments to the individual's needs and mistakes and things that they did well as well, it's more, it's important for formative assessment, right? So here are some key strategies for enacting formative assessment from Black and William in 2009, right? Black and William put forward that whole notion of assessment for learning as opposed to assessment of learning, right? So assessment for learning, assessment that improves and enhances learning in the classroom, right? So it's very important to clarify and share intentions and criteria for success. And one way of doing that is what Eddie was talking about, sharing the rubric with the students, right? Share the criteria with them. How can they achieve what they need to do to be able to achieve success in a particular assignment, right? Engineer effective classroom discussions and other learning tests that elicit evidence of student understanding, right? Provide feedback that moves learners forward, right? You're not, like I said, it's not just feeding back, it's feeding forward as well. Activate students as instructional resources for one another, like Elena was just talking about, right? Peer assessment, give peer feedback as well, right? And that can show, and I think it's very interesting what you said, like, oh, if you didn't notice the mistake that this person make, is probably because you don't know that this is a mistake either. So it's very enlightening, right? And it's very empowering as well, because you're empowering your students as the owners of their own learning. So I think it's very important, all these strategies to do formative assessment well, right? And the tasks, and I'm gonna go beyond just the tasks, but also the scoring systems as well, affect feedback, right? It is not only the content of the feedback that contributes to advancing students' learning. The tasks on which the feedback is based play an equally pivotal role. If your tasks are not good to begin with, you're not going to have effective feedback, right? So as teachers, we need, and assessors, we need to be able to create sound tasks that will measure what we want them to measure, right? Not tasks that are measuring, that are being contaminated by different skills, and you're trying to test one thing, but you test another. So we have to be very careful with the creation and development of our assessment materials, because then feedback it's going to come after this, right? So I think tasks, and paying attention to our tasks and to our scoring systems as well. Like, for example, a well-crafted rubric, right? How many times like a badly crafted rubric can even, one, confuse the feedback, the students have no idea what's going on, not give a grade that is actually a grade that will measure what the students did. It measures extraneous things, like, for example, I don't know, creativity or subjective things as well, right? So it's very important that we pay attention to the tasks and to the scoring systems, and then later on our feedback, right? To give effective feedback, we know that when we do that, it increases student motivation. It builds on this existing knowledge and helps students reflect on what they have learned or not learned so far, right? So that these should be our goals when giving feedback. But to give effective feedback, we need to understand how learning takes place. And I think this is also related to what about before, right? Understand the mistake is coming from, understand how learning, what it means to be able to learn a language and to learn a language as well, right? So identify and be able to understand how language learning takes place. Understand the nature and uses of feedback in advancing student learning. So it's not something that we just automatically know, right? We need to be able to study and understand those things and acquire the skill, right? Know what types and modes of feedback exist. And by knowing that there are different types of feedback, we need to choose the most effective one for the purposes, right? This is definitely not also a good way to provide feedback, right? Do you have any specific feedback or comments for me? Yes, do more. Well, can you be a little more specific? Do more now. Right, that's too specific. So let's take a moment here and let's talk a little bit about effective feedback and effective feedback for different skills, right? Depending on what you're teaching, you are going to, and what kind of assessment you're giving, you will need to provide feedback that is related to the task that you're giving, and that will be able to move students forward to whatever task that they have to accomplish next, right? So if you would like to share, are there any specific, besides of what has been mentioned here, for example, for writing tasks, right? Having a rubric, right? But how about for a reading test? what kind of feedback is more effective for reading tests? Should we give feedback on reading tests, for example? Eddie, can I call on you? How do you, I know that you taught reading for a while, so.
I'm sorry, you mean reading
Mm.
test, that is their understanding?
Yes, a reading test in general, like that will test specific strategies, like for example, being able to identify a main idea or details.
Mainly
I-
when they, okay, sorry.
Eddie,
No,
go
go
ahead.
ahead,
And then,
please. Go ahead, Elena.
Thank you. Well, when I see that some of them make mistakes or they don't understand some parts of the text, I ask them to find this very passage where the answer is to the question and try to speculate on it, whether it is right or not, who is right or who is not. So I try with the students to voice, to
explain the cognitive process.
right, to explain the right passage, the right part of the text, and to say whether the right answer is and why this very answer is the right. And then I ask them to say why this and this version, which is incorrect answers, they are not right. Why? What information in the text gives us that this or that very question is not right?
So encouraging students to talk through their processes, especially, and I think that's very important, especially for reading and listening, which are invisible skills, right? Reading and listening and the processes that happen while the students are reading and listening are in their brains. There's no production, right? So I think I agree that it's very important to actually have have them walk you through their thinking process as they are doing it. And I think it's also important after you give a test, right? And then you bring back the test to class and you just return it and then forget about it. Let's talk about it. Eddie?
I was thinking, I mean, for reading, I guess listening too can be, it's kind of hard to give feedback, I guess, in the sense that usually with, like, for example, reading tests, usually it's how they perform on the test, and most of the answers are either right or wrong, and how well they did on the test or how poorly they did on the test is the feedback, kind of telling them, because it's hard to give instantaneous feedback on comprehension matters. But it just occurred to me, one of the things I found effective when I was teaching reading, for example, and we would do we're doing chapter quizzes or whatever, but we would correct them together in class. So we would, I would pick up all the tests, and we would either the last few minutes of class or the beginning of next class, I would hand them out to different students, and we would correct the test together. But while I'm giving the answers, sometimes I would explain, okay, this is why A was the best answer or B was the best answer, etc. And then students would go ahead and correct it. So it can be tricky giving feedback, for reading and listening. I have a question about feedback. So if giving feedback about student presentations, and my question is about giving feedback to students in front of the class, giving public feedback to students about how well or poorly their presentation was. And some teachers do that. It's something I never do that. I would sit in the back and, with my rubric, and I would give them feedback on it. But I remember I was teaching in Japan, and I had a student teacher, and suddenly she jumped up and started giving feedback to a student who had just given a presentation, which wasn't very good. And she kind of told her it wasn't very good in front of everybody. And I didn't know she was going to do that. And I told her, I said, don't do that. I told her, I at least I wasn't comfortable for doing it. But some teachers will do that. They'll give feedback like on a speaking task in front of the class or other students. So I wonder how people feel about that.
Well, I think that feedback that addresses mistakes or things that the class as a whole has done then you address it. It's a faster way to address it to the
Yeah.
entire class, but not specifics, right? Something that, oh, most people didn't do this. So I think in that case, it's okay to address the entire class, but if it's personal feedback, then it is personal feedback to that person, right?
So
You
it-
shouldn't
so,
be just,
Tony, it shouldn't be delivered in front of the class.
I would never do that. No, right? Elena, is that how you feel too? A feedback that addresses general things that the class has done as a whole, then it's okay to give feedback to the entire classroom. But then personal feedback, how they have done, then it's personal, right? It's an one-on-one, right, on the mode of feedback that you're giving.
Something interferes with understanding because of some fails in the connection. So I can't sometimes
Okay.
understand. Okay, it's okay. Okay, thank you. Okay,
All right.
I
So
explained while I'm
everyone-
sitting and listening very carefully.
Yeah, perfect. So take a look at this. I found this online for 1912, right? Can good composition teaching be done under present conditions? And the first word is no, right? And this is probably because of, and that they go on to discuss feedback, right? This person in particular, this Professor Hopkins, had about 100 students in his class. And so he's basically talking about, can good teaching be done in these conditions, meaning with so many students, and talking about feedback, like how do you give feedback? Because giving feedback is part of good, right? And so no, it cannot be done under these conditions. So we have to think about when we are giving feedback, how our present conditions make it easy or hard to provide quality feedback, right? And that comes to time, how many students you have, how many classes you're teaching. Are you teaching all writing classes? If you're teaching 3 writing classes in a given semester and you have, I don't know, 20, 30 students, usually language classes are smaller than content area classes at university, right? But we have to think about how that affects the quality of our feedback, and make sure that we're giving feedback that is still good and still effective on the things that we are in, right? Because the thing with feedback and about good feedback is that it has to be given regularly, returned in a timely manner, written in a clear language, right? And while the students are still doing it, as opposed to just at the very end, right? Of course, we want to give feedback with a final product, but it's very important to provide feedback along the way. So how do we do that effectively within the conditions that we have? And we know that, especially, I don't know so much in the United States, but when I was teaching in Brazil, I taught all afternoon and all evening and Saturday mornings, and I had a bunch of different classes. How do you do that? And how do you give good feedback outside of class time? Prepare your lessons, prepare your assessments, all with minimal time, right? So there's a lot of research about what constitutes more effective feedback, and also how you can do it better and faster. There's a lot online about people discussing how to do it better and faster as well, right? So that it doesn't take forever and it's not basically reduce your entire existence of being a teacher to giving feedback to students, right? So I think it's very important to think not just the quantity of feedback to our students. Like I said, like what I used to do is giving feedback on everything. Then I was overwhelmed. The students were overwhelmed, and I don't think it was effective, right? And we cannot assume when we give feedback that students will know what to do with it, because one of the things that this is mentioned in the literature is that different teachers have ways of giving feedback, and students are exposed to different patterns of feedback. And who actually takes the time to explain to them, to train students on how to interpret feedback, and your feedback in particular, because the way that I give feedback may be different from the way Eddie gives feedback, maybe different from the way Jorge gives feedback, or Elena, right? the way I mark something, like for example, I usually highlight stuff if it's misspelled, right? What do you do if it's misspelled? Do you ignore it, or do you do like a little X or something? So how to interpret your feedback, how to make connections between the feedback and the characteristics of the work they produce, how they can improve, and how to act on the feedback given. So what I've been doing with my classes is that before I return an assignment with my feedback, I will tell them how to interpret my feedback. Because if you see this, this is what happens. And I am consistent throughout the semester, throughout the session, with how I provide feedback to them, so that they know, okay, so they see this. So I usually tell them, and I like to do personalized feedback as well, so that it will gets interested in reading what I have to say. So my feedback usually has two components. One of them is a communication with the students. So I am interacting with the student. If they say something, say, oh, that's really cool, I tried this, for example, or this is a really interesting opinion, have you thought about this? So I am interacting with them. This is one side of my feedback. The other side of my feedback is a feedback on the language itself or on the task itself. For example, if they're writing an essay and they don't have a thesis statement, then I'll give them a feedback on, oh, there's a thesis statement missing here or something. So I have these two components for every feedback that I give. And usually the feedback that I'm only talking to them, interacting with them, like as a conversation. Oh, I've never tried this, or this is interesting. Have you been there, or have you done this? I usually write in a different color, usually green or orange or something like that. And then my feedback on the language or on the task itself, I write in a different color, right? And so that way, I found that my students wanted to read what I had talked to them. They didn't really want to read a lot of my comments about their language or things, but they didn't want to interact with me with the communication part. And by doing that, they ended up reading the other things as well. So that's how I got them to read both. And I had a really interesting experience this summer with, I was mentoring a student in our teacher training program. And she was in my grammar class. And the first assignment that I gave back, she looked at the students and the students were smiling. And she looked at me, she was like, my students never smile when they get my feedback, especially on a grammar class, on a grammar assignment. To do, and then I showed her them what I had done. I showed her what I had done, and I was like, well, they are smiling because I'm writing personal comments on different things, and I'm really real conversing them here with what they is not to lie when they're writing it, like when you're asking a question or something, a personal question, like don't lie to me because I'm gonna get to know you better. And so I think that minimizes the bad effects of feedback, and it focuses student attention, right? So I always, going back to what I'm saying here about interpretation of feedback, I tell my students how to interpret. I take the time because I think it's very important that in the beginning, and keep reiterating every time, less and less, of course, as they get used to my feedback, right? So I think that's very important to do. So a couple of different research-based tips on providing students with meaningful feedback, right? I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with these. Be as specific as possible, right? Tell them what they're doing right or wrong, what they did well, what need improvement. Tell them, and this is something I sometimes forget to do, what they're doing differently than before. Like similar to what they've done before. It's like, oh, you improved on this aspect. This was really good. Or maybe, we didn't improve that much, so we need to work a little bit more on this, but comparing to what they did before. But of course, that requires you to have a good memory and remember what they did, and depending on the number of students as well that you have, right? Just writing great job or telling them great job or not quite there yet doesn't really tell them what they did well or wrong, because each assessment has different components, right? Different parts. So just writing, oh, you got a good grade, but okay, can you improve this? There's always room for improvement, right? So just writing a blanketed, like, oh, great job, or good, or well, I don't think that's the most effective, right? One more cartoon. I'm just saying, right? I'm gonna need more specific feedback on this, right? Like I've mentioned before, the sooner the better, right? Immediate feedback is more effective than delayed feedback. provide feedback when students are still engaged with the learning and they can do something with it, right? Address the learner's advance toward a goal, right? So tell them, okay, I'm giving you feedback on this, how this information will help you get better in the future, right? The whole feeding thing. And this is a book that I've been reading. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a 2000 book called Words That Work, talking about basically it's about politics, communication, and corporate ads and how you can transfer that to your own life and the messages that you send, especially that's one thing that he goes back throughout the book, is that it's not what you say, it's what people hear, right? So no matter what you're trying to say, how well intended it is, it's what people hear. So that's the whole message of the book. And one of the things that he says is that good words that work, right? It's not only about the road ahead. It's not only about what you've done before, but what is coming forward. So I think that applies to feedback as well, right? Sometimes we focus too much on what has been done as opposed to, okay, what now going forward, right? And we have to present feedback carefully, also related to what he's saying here, right? Sometimes the most well-meaning feedback can come across the wrong way and reduce a learner's motivation, right? So we want to make sure that we want to choose our words carefully, right? And include comments on both positive and weak aspects of students' performance. And if you like, the student improved, okay, note that. Don't focus only on the negative aspects, right? And this is what he says here. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. This is something that I've been trying to learn, right? You can have the best message in the world, but the person on the receiving end would always understand it through the prism of his or her own emotions, preconceptions, prejudice, and pre-existing beliefs, right? Every message that you bring into the world is subject to the interpretations and emotions of the people who receive it. So I think this is something that we have to keep in mind when we are giving feedback to our students. And like I said, for example, how I used to do it, like give feedback on everything. Well, that may overwhelm the students. They may think, oh, I don't know anything, but it's just commenting on every single thing that I did wrong. So that's actually not the best way forward, right? So think about that when you're giving feedback to your students. Give students access to information about their performance, and that goes back to what Eddie was saying about the rubrics, right? For example, you give them transparency, right? You tell them what they're going to be assessed on, what you're looking for, what good work looks like, and you give them access to that information. And then tell them if they actually have mastered the material or the learning outcomes or not. That's why it's important, like, to share the learning outcomes as well with this. So this is what I'm expecting you to be able to do. So are you able to do this? And so that will empower them as well, right? And I think Letty talked about this in the beginning of the webinar too, right? Give information about the ways of studying, reading, searching for information, on answering questions, and also get that information from them, right? Because when you're getting this information from them, you're able to understand better where they're coming from, where the mistake is coming from, and then you're better able to give targeted feedback, right? And feedback should be interactive, not one-sided. And this is something that I think it's very important. It should be something that you're getting information from the student, you're giving information to the student. So it's a two-way road as well, right? So just to finalize here, the most effective feedback is focused, clear, considers motivation and learning, right? Not justifying a grade or on copy editing, right? Here are some suggestions that I think are effective, right? Use comments to teach rather than justify the grade. A lot of the times I feel like we tend to, okay, we're trying to justify the grade that they got by giving those comments, right? No, focus on what going forward, right? And link your comments and feedback to the goals of the assignment. And then goes back to, are your assignments testing the outcomes that you want to be tested, right? Are they measuring what you want to measure, okay? Plan early opportunities for students to get feedback on ways of thinking, writing, or problem solving, right? so that they don't develop or repeat common errors. I think this is something Elena mentioned, right? So that they learn how to once, and then they can apply that later on, right? Collaborative learning exercises. Elena, did you get my slides before before I did this, right? Avoid over-commenting or picking apart students' work. That's definitely for me. And ask questions, right? Don't just tell them what to do. Ask questions to your students, right? And think about alternatives to writing comments on every individual student's work, right? Provide feedback to the whole class orally and or in a shared written document. Have the class read sample student work together with no names, right? Or something that your other class has done, right? In the past, to look for common themes or apply evaluation criteria. I think this is very important. I actually sometimes I write, like if I'm teaching a writing class, I will write the essay myself and I'll make mistakes on purpose and I'll give to the students, and then we have like mistakes that I know that they usually make, but the writing comes from me, right? So we evaluate that together. And thinking of alternative ways to give feedback to students also helps us in terms of time, right? So addressing the whole class, or oh, then for this specific assignment, I'm going to do one-on-one conference, or for this specific assignment, I want to record something. Like I've done recordings online when I was teaching online. So voice was much easier than writing. But do students understand better just listening, or they understand better of reading, right? So think of alternative ways and the most effective ways for that particular skill, task, and proficiency level of the students, right? And this is another book that I read last year. It's called Word by Word, and it's basically talking about writing novel and writing fiction in the process of writing, right? But she talks about many different things, and one of the things that she talks about is having someone read your work, right? Find someone in the world, maybe a spouse, maybe a close friend, your teacher, right? Will read your finished draft and give you an honest critique, right? And I think that's what we should be aiming for with our students, being honest with them about what they're doing correctly and what they're not doing correctly. Some suggestions on things that they shout or things that they need to elaborate on, right? Which ways in which they can make. It's just basically talk about writing that is stronger, but I think it applies to everything that we do. Stronger, their writing is stronger, their listening skills, right? So I think we want to be that close person that will give honest feedback and that our students can trust us. And I think that's the most important thing, for them to get the feedback and be motivated about it, because they know that you're being honest, because they have trust. So I think that that's what we should aim for in our classrooms, right? As their teacher and as assessors and as feedback givers as well, right? So here are my references, from the literature. You'll have access to that as well. I would like to say thank you for joining me today, and also to Mark Aldrin for sponsoring today's webinar. If you have any questions, please email me. And I would like to also thank Eddie for the opportunity to have done all these webinars this year. This is my last webinar for the Society this year. We'll not have another one, but you can find all the video recordings online on the Society page. So thank you, Eddie, for giving me the opportunity to do those. I learned a lot from the contributions and from doing these as well. And I hope I helped increase people's assessment literacy, or think about things in a different way as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, all of you, for giving us
Thank
the
you.
opportunity to talk, to discuss some professional ideas and issues. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you.
And a big thank you to you, Tanya. You've done a wonderful job with the webinar, so thank you.
Yeah. Right, so let me share that.
It's a pity to say goodbye.